Tell us who pushed the button. Which button?
I got it, it's under control. All right. So this is about the 5th Tisha B'Av that I have given a little historical account of history, and my goal at the beginning was to rewrite Jewish history, because I found that history was written by those who are in power, and often Jews were not in power and were overlooked as their contributions to history. And I thought that while Israel was in power, we needed to rewrite history from a Jewish perspective. So I started off with Christopher Columbus, talking about how he was potentially a Marrano Jew, and with concepts that the money that came for the trip was from Jewish Marranos, that the equipment that they used, the navigational equipment, was also of Jewish design, etc., etc. We went further, we discussed a little bit about the Jewish pirates of the Caribbean, who were basically entrepreneurs who were pirating the Spanish fleet as they went from the New World back to the Old World with gold. And one of the biggest pirates just happened to be a Jewish pirate. And he pulled off the biggest heist of all time. Then we talked a little bit about Jewish gangsters and how they were instrumental in getting weapons and money to Israel when the US had an embargo on military and financial aid to Israel. And one of the previous ones, I talked a bit about the relationship between Fordism and Nazism, where I made a thesis that the Holocaust and the death camps were basically assembly lines that would come in and take apart Jewish people like an assembly line, and you had like a hierarchy of vertical integration of two types of death camps. Some were just for work, some were just for death, and explored the relationship between Adolf Hitler and Henry Ford, which was quite a strong relationship. So last night, the rabbi talked about the shoes. When he went to Poland on the Living Legacy, at the same time I went to Israel. I was going to go on that Living Legacy trip, but I was a little torn because of the war in Russia, and I went straight to Israel. But he made a very interesting point last night where he talked about the barracks of shoes, and how when you go into the death camps and you see 1 million shoes, you get overwhelmed with it. And the idea was to find one shoe and to think about that one shoe and put yourself in that shoe of a person who had a dream or had beliefs or had goals, and how that life was taken away. So I wanted to use the analogy of a shoe and take that to refer to a single person that had a very large influence on the Arab-Israeli conflict, whose name has really been not clearly clarified in the history world. I think it's gone a little bit below the radar. And this talk is really something that Ezra originally and I had talked about for many years as something we needed to put on the table. And Ezra is now in Gush Etzion, and I just saw him a couple of months ago. He drove me around Israel. We went to a paratrooper base. We went to Masada, a bunch of things. And he just called in to tell me some information that I want to share with you as we get into. So this one is also dedicated to my good friend Ezra Ridgely, who has made Aliyah and is visiting the Temple Mount and sharing information. And this was really his idea to talk about the Mufti of Jerusalem. So there's 3 sections to this conversation, and we'll start off with who was the Mufti. The Mufti of Jerusalem, his name was Amin al-Husseini, and he was born in 1897 in Jerusalem, and he died in 1974 in Beirut, Lebanon. He was appointed in 1921 to be the Mufti of Jerusalem by the British. the British had a mandate over Palestine according to the San Remo Conference. So when the Ottoman Empire broke up, they gave different mandates to different countries. Britain had a section, the French had a section, and Britain had the mandate for Palestine where Israel was, and they appointed him the Mufti, or the spiritual leader of Palestine. What was happening is that Jews were starting to become Zionists, and they were moving into the British mandate. And the Mufti was getting upset to see Jews moving in, and he wanted to stop the flow of Jews, and he went in an uprising against the British. He rebelled, I'm sorry. So the British landed up chasing him, and he landed up fleeing originally to Lebanon, and then finally to Germany, where he was there from 1939 to 1945. And while he was there, he was quite vocal, and he used to issue broadcasts about stopping immigration to Israel. Netanyahu made a claim that it was the Mufti of Jerusalem that suggested the concept of the final solution to Adolf Hitler. And a bunch of historians took odds at that claim that Netanyahu said, because they said the Nazi regime had already made that decision 6 months earlier. So it's a little bit of a, controversial point, but what we know for sure is that the Mufti wanted Jews dead because he didn't want them emigrating to Israel. And what he did want to do is he wanted to create I should call it a Middle Eastern front, where he had a coalition with Adolf Hitler and the Nazis to create death camps and to stop the flow of Jews into the Middle East. And the Mufti of Jerusalem was also known as the author of the Big Lie. The Big Lie is the claim that the Jews were scheming to destroy the Alaska Mosque and build his temple over that, over the existing mosque. So the Mufti had a very spiritual importance in the Middle East, and this particular personality really is not very prevalent in our history books, and I thought, and Ezra felt as well, that it was important to kind of highlight his input into this Arab-Israeli conflict. The other thing that a lot of people don't know is that the Mufti of Jerusalem was also the uncle of Yasser Arafat. So the lineage of anti-Semitism, anti-Zionism, anti-Judaism starts earlier, but it goes through that lineage that starts with the Mufti. And when I was talking about this lecture, I got a call from Ezra, who told me the other thing is he goes to the Temple Mount regularly, and that he saw that the burial site of the Mufti of Jerusalem is on top of the Temple Mount. And he said, there's pictures on the internet. So I looked, I couldn't find any photos. He says, I'll send you a picture, but he goes up there regularly. So the Mufti is buried next to the King of Jordan on the Temple Mount. So in 2015, they had the it's called the Alaska Intifada, and also known as the Knife Intifada. And what was happening is the incitement is that they're trying to recreate this ancient lie that the Jews want to take over the Temple Mount, and they were defending the Temple Mount. Today, there was a notice in the Jerusalem Post that Ben Gvir walked on the Temple Mount, and the U.S. was completely upset because they find that as a form of incitement, that the Jews are scheming to overcome the status quo and take back the Temple Mount. Whether that is a truth or not, I don't think we're scheming. I think we want some rights to our holiest site, but that the knowledge that the Mufti is buried there, which he's not allowed to be buried there next to the King of Jordan, I think is knowledge that the general world doesn't know, and perhaps that's why they don't want us on the Temple Mount, because they've done things which are illegal. So my thesis is that we all look for solutions for the Arab-Israeli conflict, and I think there's a deeper spiritual issue that's going on, whereas the secular movement and the kind of this legislative war, some people are calling it a civil war between the left and the right, or the religious and the secular, is really how to figure out how to solve this problem with a conflict. The secular thinking is give them land and they'll be happy, peace for land, and the religious people are saying they will never be happy no matter how much land we have, and a little bit more of a religious issue. So I want to talk about Megiddo, which is the second word in my speech title. Megiddo is a place just southeast of Haifa, and it's a kind of like used to be a watering well, but it's all in the Christian world. It's also related to as Armageddon, where the forces of light and the forces of dark will have their final battle. And so in my argument today, I'm suggesting that what we are in is the battle between light and dark, which takes me to the Mossad mission, where we traveled around and we listened to various lecturers about this conflict and how they are looking at it and how they're trying to solve it. So the Mossad part of this is interesting, because what the Mossad has been trying to do, there was a IDF officer by the name of Meir Dagan, who is very famous in Israel as a very ruthless and creative warrior, and he was one of the original guys that learned how to go into the territories and disguise themselves as various Arabs or different dignitaries from other countries. And there's a story where he made up a claim that he was a visiting prince from another Arab area, and he was interviewing some terrorists, and he made them prove to him that they were credible, and he got all types of information from these terrorists by impersonating an Arab officer. So he's a very clever leader, and he became the head of the Mossad. And what he felt, or what he found, was that with the rise of Hamas, that there was something called dawah, which was the spiritual contribution to the Muslim faith. So Hamas was not just a military group, it was also a social group, and they appeared to be raising funds for social causes. And Dawa would use that umbrella to fund money from North America into the hands of Hamas, which was then used to buy weapons, suicide vests, vehicles to transport terrorists from different parts of Israel into Israel and create these attacks. And it became prevalent after the Oslo Peace Accords. In 1993, the rate of the Intifada and the suicide bombings was becoming intense, and so what they did was they started to find the funnel of money. According to Meir Dagan, money is oxygen for terrorism. So they want to shut down the oxygen to shut down the Intifada. And they started to go through finding out how to find the banking system and go after them. At the same time, or roughly in 1994, there was an Aish Torah rabbi sitting around with a young university lawyer, And they were university activists, or I should say, they were activists, and they wanted to stop the allowance of Mahmoud Abbas to enter into Israel to take over the Palestinian Authority from Yasser Arafat. And they came up with an idea to take the Israeli police to court. And that rabbi from Eshet Torah I just met in Tiberias, he told me this story while I was on the Mossad mission, and his name is Shmuel Vefer. I don't know if you know Shmuel. So Shmuel and Nitzana go back to when she was a law student, and this was like 20-something years ago, and they had this idea as, young activists to stop this process by taking Israel to court. And it had never been done before. And they signed an action, they got it, and the only way to do it is to go to the superior court, where there's like 6 superior judges, and they put Nitzana in front, and she was like a 20-something-year-old little lady, and they put her as spokesperson for the group. And, the court didn't know what to do, and they told them to withdraw the case. And Shmuel said to me, he says, yeah, but we didn't withdraw. And then they went back and they said, please withdraw your case. And then they huddled again, and then they didn't know what to do. So they conceded. And they conceded and they withdrew the case, but then the victory was that they never received costs. So the courts can penalize you for wasting their time, but they were never awarded costs, so they realized that they had a valid action that could be used for future cases. And from that small little non-victory, Nitzana created this entire practice of law where she would go after terrorist organizations and sue them for damages based on a 1992 Anti-Terrorism Act, subsection 233A, for civil remedy. It was an American act that was passed which allowed any American to sue a terrorist organization in court for damages that they had received. So what she realized, she couldn't take civil actions to the international court in Den Haag because it was a biased court. So she would take the terrorist groups to Washington or New York and use this 1992 Anti-Terrorism Act. And from there, she started to build. So I think she graduated law school in 1990, or it was 2002 when she started her thing. So this law had been in existence for a few years, and she manipulated that law to go after the institutions that supported the terrorist groups. So she could find where the money was and put liens on the actual institutions and the executives that were allowing terrorists to open up accounts and put money through it. And the Mossad found out what she was doing, and the book tells you the story. This is the book of Harpoon. How they called her up, and she was working in in her house with a bunch of students. It was like a frat house, she said, and they got a call from this low-speaking guy that wanted to meet her. So she realized, I think the phone was ringing, it was a summer day. Finally, they realized it was someone serious because it was very curt wording. And the Mossad likes to meet in restaurants, and they like to sit at the back of the restaurant with nothing to their back, looking at the front door. So here was this young lawyer that was called to go meet Mayor Dagan and Uri, who were very serious counterterrorism, tough guys, who had found out about this young lady who started these civil actions using this anti-terrorism clause. And so they picked her brains and tried to learn how they could expand this operation. See, the state of Israel cannot sue a terrorist organization, so they needed to have an independent law office, and it was set up like a non-profit. And it was based on a U.S. Law firm that worked, I forget the model, but it was something to do with human rights, black human rights. So it became a human rights nonprofit that was not owned by the state of Israel, that was independent and funded independently. And she would take cases on behalf of the victims of terror. And the numbers are in there. In some of the pamphlets, you'll see the numbers where she's won judgments of almost $1 billion and has got about 100 different actions going on around the world. And Ehud Olmert, who took over the presidency or the prime minister of Israel when Yitzhak Rabin was murdered, was a lawyer. And apparently Olmert used to call her all the time to find out how she was using, or what type of ideas she was using to go after the terrorists, because they were very creative. So I'll tell you one other story which I liked, which was about the flotilla. Do you guys remember the flotilla? So there was a first flotilla, Mavi, they came from Turkey. Israel said stop, they wouldn't stop. They sent in the commandos, we went down, some guys came down, and they were all ready for the Israeli officers. They had bats, they had crowbars, and the guys were coming down and they got smashed by these terrorists, which they called themselves activists, but were actually terrorists. And until the last guy came down with a weapon, and he protected the guy that was beaten up, because they were going to take him down into the boat and decapitate him or something, and he killed 10 of these activists, and there was a big problem with Israel's public relations. I remember walking into work one day and my Persian guys looking at me in horror that Israel had just killed 10 peace activists on the Mavi, and I had no idea what had happened until I looked into it. Anyways, there was supposed to be a second flotilla. Did anybody hear about that one? So what happened is that there was going to be another flotilla, and Nitzana found another 1700 anti-piracy act in the US, and kind of said that any ship that sails from another port that enters water of another country can be charged with piracy. So she sent letters to all the insuring companies. First they called them, they wouldn't speak to her. She sent letters to all the insurance companies notifying that these ships, should they leave, will be considered pirates and will be confiscated. So all the insurance companies dropped their insurance coverage over those ships, and some of them decided to go anyways, and she put a lien on those ships. She had the Israeli Navy tow the ships to Ashdod, and then she sold the ships and gave the money to the victims of terror. So these are the types of things that Israel and this particular lawyer is doing. And she has a very good sense of humor. She's really funny and very personable. And so she's on a mission, and this is what the Mossad is now using to try to defend Israel. And it's Tisha B'Av, and the idea here in my mind is that we talk about the destruction of the temple and other tragedies. In a way, Israel is our collective temple for the world. So we have to do what we can so that Israel should never be destroyed again. And having just toured all the military infrastructure, they are working 24/7, 7 days a week, because the numbers of attempts are endless. The Arabs are from the Judea and Samaria, they go into East Jerusalem, they find a friend that has a car, or they buy a car with East Jerusalem license plates, so they can sneak across the border into Israel, and that's how they do their attacks, by using East Jerusalem license plates. I was in the north, and we saw a terror tunnel that Hezbollah had built, which is really Iran, and it went down 29 stories, across 1 kilometer, and up 29 stories. These tunnels are not little tunnels, they are actual infrastructure with stairs, with air conditioning, lighting, places to leave equipment, handrails, and it's a very sophisticated tunnel. And what the Israelis did was they blocked off one side, they blew it up, they kept the other side to show the world what Hezbollah is trying to do. It was a sophisticated idea where they would storm out of the tunnel, take over an intersection, control traffic, and then have more troops come through and take over the north of Israel. And thank goodness the IDF found it. But when you see them in real life, you see hatred at its fullest. And I remember my friend Elliot Katz told me when he was in Poland and he saw the walls of, I think it was Auschwitz, or was it Warsaw?
Warsaw, yeah.
In Warsaw. And you see those walls in Warsaw, you say, wow, they must have really hated us. Well, those walls have been converted into tunnels. And when I saw that, I went, wow, those guys really hate us. So this is what's going on. And I consider, there was a bat mitzvah here where David talked about the importance of the Jewish woman. And he talked about how it was Queen Esther that saved the Jewish people from Haman when she went to Achashverosh to petition him. And I liken this Nitzana Leitner to the Queen Esther as a modern Queen Esther of what she's doing. So I'm going to conclude with a few speakers that I heard and share with you. We spent a day with a guy who's, I shouldn't say a guy, a gentleman. He was a brigadier general in the Israeli army. His name is Gal Hirsch. Has anybody heard of him? He's famous in Israel. He was a major commander, and we were in a kibbutz in Israel overlooking the beautiful hills of Lebanon. And he says to us, you see those houses over there? Well, those garages have hydraulic lifts. And in certain times when there have been wars, those garages lift up and out come rocket launchers. So you're sitting there and you think you're in Muskoka, but it's really a war zone. And General Hirsch had been fighting. He said, I was in battles on this hill, on that hill, and they know the hills because they fought there. But in one time he got ambushed, and he said, I had 97% of my body paralyzed. And he was in hospital, the doctors did a bunch of surgery, and apparently the terrorists, they knew him, they knew who he was. It's like a personal issue when you're fighting these wars, I guess. And he said, I want to go back to my command. And the doctor said, you're crazy, you can barely move. And all he says, he starts to move one finger. He says, I'm alive, I want to go back. This is the type of determination these IDF commanders have. And eventually he got full of his control of his body, and when we were walking in these areas up and down the tunnels, he was like he'd never been injured before. And there's a bad story to it. He was supposed to be get a very high position in the internal police, and he got politically outmaneuvered. Then he got cancer, and so he's fighting cancer now. But he's a real hero of Israel, and he said to us that in order to fight a war, you need to have a strong ideology, something that you believe in. And he says that's what the IDF has. It's a very moral army, and it has a very strong ideology, and that's what keeps the people of Israel safe. So we then traveled on, and we were in Jerusalem, and we had a session with a Palestinian political commentator by the name of Bassam Eid. Anybody hear of him? Anyways, he's Arab, very well spoken, and he told us a little bit about what life was from the Arab sector. And this was right after we just had this last round of rockets from Hamas. And people asked him a lot of questions, and he was balanced. And then I asked him this question. I said, the general said, in order to be good fighters, you need to have